Maybe we
Yep.
can get started. Wonderful. Well, my name is Zrinka Stahuljak. I am the director of the Center for Early Global Studies here at UCLA. And I'm very happy to welcome you all to this latest edition of the New Book Salon. Some of you may remember that we actually held this event quarterly during the pandemic. This has now become an occasional series at the Center for Early Global Studies because, as you well know, also publications are kind of an irregular creature. So we take them as they come, and we encourage our faculty and associate members to contact us if you would like to present your book in discussion with another colleague. Then please reach out. Today's book under discussion and our two wonderful guests are Professor Claire Farago and Amelia Jones, who will discuss Claire's latest book, Writing Borderless History of Art, Human Exceptionalism and the Climate Crisis, that was published this last summer by Routledge. And of course, with the centers, for those of you who know our programming and who know our work, with the center's ongoing Mellon project that interrogates the epistemic foundations of academic disciplines through indigenous knowledges, this new book Salon really fits in our thinking together. Professor Emerita Claire Farago is associate faculty of CMRS-CEGS since 2017, when she retired from the University of Colorado Boulder and moved here to Los Angeles. She has published extensively on processes of transculturation, the epistemological foundations of art history, the materiality of the sacred, the writings of Leonardo da Vinci, critical theory, and critical museum studies. In 1995, she published an anthology reframing the Renaissance that introduced transcultural approaches to art history, and followed that up with Art is Not What You Think It Is, which was a monograph, and then an edited volume, Grasping the World, The Idea of the Museum. Alongside this latest new book that we will be talking about today and celebrating, she published a co-edited volume, Transcultural Histories of Art and Artisanal Epistemologies. Her discussant is Amelia Jones, who is Robert A. Day Professor at the Roski School of Art and Design at USC here in LA, and is a curator and scholar of contemporary art, performance, and feminist and sexuality studies. Her 2021 book, entitled In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance, explores the history of performance art and queer theory since the 1950s. She curated the exhibition Ken Gonzalez Day, Histories Never Made, at USC Fisher Museum in 2025, and is currently working on a book addressing the neoliberalism and structural racism in Euro-American University and art complex called Life Work Against Cultural Capitalism. So welcome again. Thank you for being here with us today. And I'm going to hand it over now to Claire and Amelia.
Great. Excited to be here. I'm just going to pop up the cover, and I think Claire had a few words to say before we start our conversation.
Thank you, Zrinka, and everyone at UCLA that has invited me to do this book launch. I'm really excited to do it here, partly because this is at the other end of a trajectory of work that began with reframing the Renaissance that Zrinka just mentioned, where I was a visiting distinguished professor funded by the Arts Council chair in 1997-98. And at that time, I co-organized a conference, an international conference on race, nation, and aesthetics, which in many ways is the prequel to this book right now. So it's a great honor for me to be here, and it just feels really appropriate to be with this wonderful interdisciplinary group of scholars. Yeah, so I wanted to say that. So we're going to do a dialogue. It's going to be pretty informal. I don't know how it's going to work, but I think that Amelia is going to be asking me some questions.
Yeah, well, I noticed that your first slide or your second slide is apropos of our first conversational point, which is the climate change, climate theory, and human exceptionalism. And one of my favorite things about the book is that you connect so many things that most people focusing on the contemporary wouldn't think of connecting. So maybe I'm going to take this down just so people can see us. But if you want to go back to some of the slides, we can do that, of course. Yeah, so maybe you could talk a little bit more about that nexus of how, you know, why climate change and how you're understanding climate change, not just as this kind of contemporary crisis, but as something that you're tracing back to early modern and even pre-modern thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to write about climate change. I came up with this book idea when Trump was elected the first time, and I had a feeling that climate efforts were going to be really affected. I had no idea what was in store for all of us, but I wanted to think about human exceptionalism and the discourse on art and the discourse on humanness and how they were entangled together with the long, slowly emerging climate crisis. And so I had started to say this before I lost contact with you all, that we need to look at the entire Western tradition to understand human exceptionalism. And so I took on the project of, and this goes with my expertise very well, which I'll explain in a minute, but I took on the project of looking at the Aristotelian idea that humans are exceptions to the rest of nature and looking at that in a historical context, because it is a real underpinning for Western ideas. And that's one anchor point. And the other point is that these Aristotelian arguments in a more complex form through Aristotle's treatise on the politics were very important in evaluating the humanness of Amerindians when the Spanish first invaded the Americas. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but the basic idea is that the Amerindians, indigenous peoples of the Americas, were not part of the European knowledge base. Until then, they weren't recorded in any text. And so the question came up, were they truly human or just human in form? And this was not an innocent question by any means, because on the one hand, they had to be rational creatures to be converted to Christianity, which was the overt reason for coming to the Americas and getting new souls. And on the other hand, if they weren't fully human, then they could be used like other animals to get goods, material resources from the Americas. So it was on that basis that the humanness of Amerindians was initially established. And that, in a nutshell, is what I have been looking at. I don't want to launch into a monologue here, but those were the framing conditions.
So how does climate theory in a early modern sense play into this? Because that's what's so amazing, is how you show the interconnectedness.
Yeah, so I was I was a little bit pushing back against eco-critics that think that the climate crisis was something that maybe goes back to the 17th century Enlightenment philosophers. And I wanted to see things in a much more historical way. I was very happily influenced by the work of Jason Moore, who has written about capitalism and climate as being a historical construct. And it indeed is. So the rate at which what Moore calls commodity frontiers, the rate at which material resources degraded the environment was really stepped up in this early modern period of Europeans exploring, going beyond their European base and establishing colonies elsewhere, or trying to. And so when the resources dried up in one place or became too expensive, they just moved somewhere else. And that caused an amount of environmental damage that was unparalleled in the entire history of the world. There are many other good projects about environmental destruction. I'm not saying this is the only one, but this was a big one. So thinking about the intersection of how people were evaluated for their humanness on the basis of Aristotle's idea that humans think and create art, whereas animals act by instinct. And the application of that idea to Amerindians to establish degrees of humanness, so some people are more human than others, is really the precursor of race theory, and it went through something that is climate theory. So we were always looking at the interrelationship between people and environments, and the question of how we do that is very interesting to see ourselves as kind of doppelgangers in the historical record. So that's what I've been working on. My background, for those of you that don't know it, and why should anyone know that, is that I have been a specialist on Leonardo da Vinci's writings on the status of the arts, which involves looking at the entire history of this Aristotelian construct and looking at that commentary tradition. So that's a place that I felt comfortable. I had no idea how much work would be involved in trying to take that 16th century idea through 400 years, but that's what this book is about.
Yeah, and you have in your, I think it's a good segue to the subtitle of your introduction, which is Taking Responsibility in the Age of Capital. So there's an underlying political urgency in the project. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Amelia, because I also wanted this book to be for a broader audience. So I usually write for specialists, or at least for Renaissance specialists, and not a word I usually use, but I usually write for a totally academic audience. And I wanted this book to be much broader. So I wanted it to be accessible, but also to be scholarly at the same time. So I'm not sure I responded to your question totally.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's the responsibility we need to take? What is?
Well, everybody is responsible for knowing how the knowledge that they produce works in society, but at the same time, nobody can be responsible for the effects that they produce only for so long. So taking responsibility in the age of capital, for me, very personally, meant that I wanted my knowledge base to be useful to think about sustainability on the planet and to think critically about the barriers. And so borderless is an interesting concept there. It doesn't mean I got rid of borders. It just meant that I transgressed borders. I transgressed, most of all, geographical borders whilst paying attention to subdisciplinary formations. I transgressed temporal borders, again, while paying attention to them. And it was only in getting rid of these geographical and temporal borders that art historians practice, so my specialization is very narrow in that sense, that I could see the continuity of certain thought structures and epistemological constructs, and really ontology as well as that. So that's the way I approach the subject that I hope will be a good contribution to debate. It's not a finished final thing. This is not the final word by any means. It's meant to elicit discussion and debate.
Yeah, so for those who aren't art historians, it's a discipline obsessed with boundaries, including period specializations, but also geographically, and then some weird like hybrid things, like you're an Islamicist, you apparently can't study the Jewish synagogue that's 100 feet away from the mosque.
Yes, that's a great.
So there's a lot of very odd aspects of those boards, but this is a good moment to share the slide showing your table of contents, because I wanted to ask then about the structure of the book, which is so innovative, and maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you. So there's a subtitle to the subtitle. So the subtitle to your plural histories of art, the subtitle is Human Exceptionalism, but the subtitle to that is 5 Fugues on the Future of the Past. And besides the alliteration, I wanted to refer to this European musical form because it seems to describe the way that my chapters individually and collectively are structured. So there are a few starts something and goes around full circle, and then everything matches up, comes together at the end. And that's the way that I structured this book. So you can read the introduction and get a sense of the whole book, or dip into it somewhere else. But there is also a through argument. There's a second sense in which the word fugue has meaning, and that is a much darker sense that I also wanted to be part of this book. And that is that psychiatric state of not knowing where you are. It's often caused by trauma. It's often caused by being displaced. And I think that refers metaphorically and all too often, and even more so now, concretely to the displaced people who are migrants that are leaving their homes, not because they want to, but because of war and climate environmental devastation. And we're going to be seeing that on a much larger scale in the coming decades. I'm afraid we're already seeing it on an enormous scale. So the way that this book is argued is that it's up to us. We are at a certain point where we can work towards sustainability. What is it that the humanities can do? How can the humanities help to make the case for science? How can the humanities provide a critical framework for science? The fragmentation of knowledge is a really key thing. So I wanted to write something that helps people get the big picture, the meta picture, but also have historical specificity and detail. So to look at a little bit more closely at this table of contents that's up here. So in the introduction, I take my title from Jason Moore's Age of Capital. Capital is seen is the other word that he uses, but that might be a little bit harder for a broader understanding to understand what I'm talking about. So Age of Capital. Moore argues that capitalism is really something that continues from the 16th century on at this mega scale of unregulated global capitalism. I just gave a very brief synopsis of his argument. The beginning just lays out that whole book and its chapters. And then I have 5 chapters, and in between some of them, I have intermezzos to continue with that musical theme, where I pick up themes that are not being part of the main argument, but allow me to really dwell on something. And temporality is a topic that is very big in art history, but much broader than art history. So that little intermezzo is about different constructs of time and temporality, and it takes on the Marxist, very good that Dipesh Chakrabarty injected into our thinking some years ago, some quarter century ago, really, about how time is it's a Marxian interpretation of the time in the equal exchange value idea of time that just destroys everybody's life world. So that's one, but it's not the only one. I won't go into that because otherwise I won't have time to do anything else. So defining an ecological approach, I lay out this Aristotelian framework and how we get from there to the 16th century. And my whole book is a transcultural framework. And my transcultural work is to connect that fragmented knowledge about European events and events in the Americas and look at both from the other side or from multiple sides. So in that first fugue, I lay that out and how the environment is involved in the destruction of the environment and the instruction of animals and the destruction of people. And then the second chapter, the European discourse, how it shaped accounts of human exceptionalism. I've already given a slight version of that argument, in which the very concretely Pope Paul III issued in 1537 an edict, a bull, in which he said that the Indians, Amerindians, we would say more better today, were fully rational creatures that could be converted without the use of force. And in that, he was also in conjunction with King Charles the First, who was also the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who was trying to think of non-violent ways that he could get hold of all those resources in the Americas, and he didn't want to end up in hell. So he got a bunch of theologians to help him out. And this argument about whether the Amerindians were fully human or not was actually coming from Aristotle's Politics, where Aristotle posited that there were, hypothetically, a group of natural slaves by nature, who were fully human, but they couldn't make their own decisions because they weren't controlling their passions. And that argument was first imposed on indigenous peoples as early as 1510. So that chapter takes us through that history and what happened with that argument, because it really set up everything for the hundreds of years. So in the response to Charles V, those theologians at the University of Salamanca said that the Amerindians, they weren't slaves by nature. They were fully rational, therefore they could be converted. But on the other hand, they lack the arts and the techne by which we define fully civilized people. So it might take several centuries for them to be really fully admitted. So we think about Paul III's decree and also Francisco de Vitoria's discussion of that was published and widely circulated in Europe as something that created universal human rights. But what my contribution to this discussion, and I'm very indebted to the work of Anthony Pagden, who's also at UCLA these days, is that the Amerindians were not part of the universal human rights because they weren't fully civilized yet. So all those discussions that were developed into European Enlightenment discussions about universal human rights that we know didn't include women either, also didn't include most of the world's humanity. So that's that very important chapter. And then the intermezzo that goes with it talks about what was nationalism before the nation state. The next one picks up, and this was the biggest surprise to me. So I thought I was going to be able to write this book in a couple of years because of my background knowledge and 30 years of thinking about these topics. But what I discovered in the process of writing chapter 3 or fugue 3, which took me 2 or 3 years to write, was that what I had been calling cultural geographies were also climate theories. And these climate theories said that where you live determined your capabilities. And the capabilities were in terms of the arts that you make, techne, art in the very broadest sense, and your moral character. And that idea, it's not just in illustrated cultural geographies that we art historians are studying these days, and that's a very fruitful area of research, but it's everywhere in philosophy, in science, in medicine, in legal documents. So that freed me up by looking at the thought structures from just looking at one discipline or one genre or one time period to try to make sense of how those iterations traveled through time and what their effects are today. And Amelia, that's one of the reasons I'm so glad that you supported this project all along and that you've agreed to be the discussant today, because these are extremely contemporary problems that we're still dealing with. And that's why that's called hauntologies. What are we still dragging along with us? Transcultural approaches, I'm looking also at the formation of art history there, but also anthropology. And then I didn't talk about this quite yet, and I don't want to turn this into a monologue, but from the beginning, I've unpacked the idea that humans are exceptional on the basis of modern science, because we now define biological identity in terms of DNA, not in terms of race or the structure of anatomy as Darwin did. We define identity in terms of the continuity and the connection of humans and archaic humans and animals all the way through the entire system of creatures on this planet. And so I wanted to distinguish what I was talking about from racial theory, and also to take a critical view at the science writing that goes on for a popular audience about genetics, ancient genetic science, which has told us it's still very much in flux, but we know that the that the whole idea of human species is not really very, it can't be contained the way that we have for hundreds of years now thought about it, because archaic humans interbred with each other and intermarried, and what we call Homo sapiens interbred with what we call Neanderthals, and they interbred with others. So that means that the whole problem of the history of culture is really opened up to what is it, where does humans culture start and stop. So that's basic to the entire book. And then the last fugue opens all of this up to how do we think about writing histories of art, multiple histories of art, without any totalizing or teleological framework. And so this project came partly out of the classroom, where I'm always using as my laboratory. And there I developed a way of approaching art and artifice and process and art making practices through the actual historical trading networks that developed on this planet. So I proposed that, but without ever thinking that we could put everything into a book. So it is also a critique of global art projects and world art projects. Anyway, that's it in a very fast talking nutshell.
It's too much to do fast. So everyone has to read the book. Can I just ask one more question? And I'm trying to find one of your slides. This isn't exactly the way the text box,
Oh yeah, I didn't explain
separate boxes work, but if you could describe the way you use these, there's separate boxes on the pages that discuss in depth certain objects. And maybe if you could kind of talk about the logic of that. And then I have a question about art history.
Yeah, no, thank you, because I meant to explain the text boxes. So I also wanted this to be a porous narrative of multiple voices. So in the case of Reframing the Renaissance many years ago, or another project I did about Native American and Spanish art called New Mexican Santos in Between Worlds, I use this idea of text boxes. It's really taken from textbooks, of inserting a little essay, a little visual essay. So most of my text boxes, unlike the screen, also have a little essay with them. And in that way, while my main argument is usually quite abstract, I could have concrete examples, complements, and counterexamples that bring in the scholarship of other people and show what is being done today. So if I'm talking about the history of Eurocentrism in my main text, and how to look at the emancipatory potential of that history, which is what this book is also very much about, then I can use the words and the language and the case studies of other people to flesh that out. Sometimes to play counterpoint. Sometimes I would even mention it in the main text, but then I can elaborate on that. Sometimes I use my own research, but for the most part, I was depending on other colleagues' work that's really exciting, so the reader can see what's possible to do in a post Eurocentric kind of art history, to recover the indigenous voices, to look at the entanglements and many other things. In this case, what you're looking at on the screen here, it's not even the oldest one anymore, but it was at the time I wrote this, the oldest evidence of archaic human tools. So these are 400,000 years old tools that were excavated, or a sampling of them. And there's even an earlier wooden structure that's almost 500,000 years before the present, which I don't have a picture. And then in the part of the book where I'm thinking about, so how do we tell the story of the beginning of art making practices, or human things made by art, which most generically just means, from its ancient roots of art and techne, just anything that is crafted. So I wouldn't even want to say by humans, because I'm looking even more broadly than that. So instead of starting with French and Spanish cave paintings, as all our primary texts do, I would think that we could do better than that and look relationally. And so I compared this recently discovered cave painting from Indonesia that's at least 45,000 years ago old, or before the present. So, about 15,000 years older than those French and Spanish cave paintings that are so beautiful. And also a cave painting from Australia that shows indigenous Australian cave painting, also about 30,000 years ago, that's in really fantastic shape. So it's a way to think about the spreading of humans across the globe and differentiating and coming up with different ways of being in the world without imposing that timeline of cultural evolutionism that is the hallmark of Eurocentric approaches to world art, have been. That goes back to the ancient times, but it was definitely developed in the 19th century. So this timeline from primitive to civilized is just endemic everywhere. So how do you do things differently? And this is my approach to that.
Great. I'm going to step out of the PowerPoint so people can see you well. And that's a segue to my last couple of questions. And then I hope we'll have time for some conversation with the audience. One of the questions that you and I have debated at length is the question of why borderless histories of art, like why are you still referencing the discipline of art history in my mind? When, I mean, you just kind of explained that you actually want art to mean something much broader.
Well, it did.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm just saying that histories of art or art history call forth the 19th century disciplinary formation. So why wouldn't you pose this book in a broader historical context? Because it seems like you're dealing with artifacts that are so much broader than what are generally now considered to be artworks.
Well, that's a good question because it allows me to push back against that whole concept really straightforwardly. And for one thing, we have expanded that field. So that question of how do you organize art history in this expanded field is why people were thinking about world art in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, every world art referred to everything but European art. So it was never our concept. But in the United States, maybe in the 80s, when there was interest in rethinking Western art in our beginning courses as world art, it wasn't immediately connected to this 19th century German construct. It was thought of in terms of foundational general art history texts. So I can't get rid of art because that would put it back into a box. I can't get rid of, I don't want to get rid of art because it doesn't need to be just what we think about it now. It can be expanded. And historically, in the same Western philosophical tradition, art referred to process. And it wasn't even connected to an object. So in the 16th century, when you said the word art, it probably meant more like method or epitome. The art of I don't know, of woodworking, for example, or the art of rhetoric. And it certainly didn't refer to an object. So our constructs of art history are so anachronistic that we don't want to just live inside that box. Not only that, but the fragmentation of knowledge is one of the great hindrances to getting a big picture of anything. So if you start with art history, then you've already built that box, no matter how you try to broaden it. Whereas the discourse on art, a discursive concept of art in the Western tradition, which is what I'm looking at here, is much, much broader, spans many fields, and is divided up really historically, and the discourses I was looking at, primarily between political theory and where Aristotle's idea of human cognition had a very rich history too, but undifferentiated in terms of actual concrete objects, and what became art history. And then in the 18th, and again at the end of the 19th century, another kind of division occurred between artifacts, which now referred to everything but the fine arts, and art, which referred to this European and Eurocentrism, it's not just a thing, it's a whole complex that also involves the imposition of European values and economic globalization. So we have to think about it in terms of those broad ideas, not the decontextualized object that became the subject of art history, even more than anthropology or ethnology in the European sense. So that's why. So I don't have a problem myself with art. I just want to restore it to a broader view. And I am also totally open to rethinking that. And the anthology that I just published with Susan Lauisch and Jens Baumgarten that grew out of a session at the International Congress of the History of Art in 2022, I use the word artisanal epistemologies that I've borrowed from writers on the history of science who were themselves objecting to the idea of the scientific revolution and instead focusing on the workshops of artisans, which have always been part of this discourse for many decades. But what's new, and Pamela Smith is one that introduced this new understanding of artisanal knowledge, not just skill, but the understanding what's the assumptions on which those skills are based, is to be able to think very materially about process and technology. And that's a very useful construct because it's broad enough to include the fine arts, art with a capital A, but it also can speak to everybody's material culture. It's not that simple though, because people who are left out or created outside or their cultural productions were discounted or put lower into some kind of hierarchical scheme, they want to be part of the art discourse too. So here I depended a lot on indigenous theorists. So some indigenous theorists would just like to get rid of the word art because they don't like the whole art industry and they would rather use their own words. Like belongings, which is one that's used often, and others would like to just be part of that discourse. So I've had very interesting discussions with Ruth Phillips about this. She is a leading indigenous art scholar, American, who works in Canada and has for many years, and she has worked with First Nations peoples in Canada and built huge archives, and we've had very interesting discussions about how artisanal epistemology does and doesn't suit all different constituents. But in the case of this anthology, I mashed together the artisanal epistemology construct, which has been used most of all for European materials, but not exclusively, with transculturation theory, which focuses on processes, exchange, and movement, and not on national culture or geography or any of those problematic Eurocentric categories that we're trying to figure out what to do with.
Super clear. I'll just say one more thing and then I think we should open it up. But you actually cite this, I'm honored, in your book, the anthology that I co-edited with Jane Shin Davidson called The Companion to Contemporary Art in a Global Framework. And our whole introduction is about how disingenuous at best the idea of global art is in the contemporary context, because it almost exclusively refers to work by artists who have been gathered through a kind of parallel to the Grand Tour in the 18th century by curators kind of hopping around from country to country and picking work by artists nominally from those countries, but almost all of whom were trained in Western art schools. So that's one of the reasons you and I have had this robust debate, because I'm so suspicious of that concept as it's applied in the contemporary art world, where it's also really monetized because it's a way of the art market constantly renewing itself by bringing in things it can sell. So we should probably, Zrinka, if you agree, maybe open it up for larger conversation.
Yes, thank you very much for this super lucid and really uh, stimulating, because it's big ideas. It's a big time frame, right, to work with. It is kind of maybe not global, but planetary. So these are very, very big ideas, and it's very stimulating to just kind of plug them into the history, this art history, and rethink things. So I do want to give everyone a chance to ask questions, or maybe ask for some clarifications for, or further, not clarifications, but to go deeper into anything that was already said. It can be just a comment, it doesn't have to be a question. If you would just raise your hand if you do have a question, or feel free to throw your question in the chat, then we can get moving. I'm going to give everyone just a few seconds.
I'm going to turn on
Yes,
some more lights in my room.
sure.
Yeah.
No worries.
I hope that's a little bit better. It's just inevitable. It's just dark. That
I
was,
think we're all at this point in the dark.
yeah.
Um, um, so if there are no questions from the audience, I actually was really intrigued, and I'm very happy that you are doing this for us. So I have a few questions for you. One was partly answered right now, which is the very category of art um, to be applied to indigenous communities around the world, right? Where I understand you spoke with indigenous studies scholars or indigenous artists. Um,
Both. Both.
Sounds like in North America,
And
right?
in Australia and New Zealand.
Oh, yes, great. So it is. It problem, because I think for contemporary artists working today, wishing to be part of the sort of artistic scene in that sense of scene, is one thing, but the reference to objects, not artifacts, that may have been created over a long time is far more problematic, right? As art, because precisely it's that definition that put of art that made them into artifacts and put them into museums, and so took them out of
Right.
community use, right? So I did kind of want to, again, positing it maybe slightly differently with this um extra explanation, but kind of push yet again on what Amelia was saying, which is, why do we still want to call this art, um, if we are thinking about borderless, that is giving up this idea of nation state and of in a sense property rights of particular groups that are Western over, right? Why do we still want to talk about art as that kind of uh, hopelessly, uh, especially 19th century defined aesthetic and objectification of even objects into artifacts?
So that's a really good question. It's very complicated, and I agree that it's not a perfect word, but I also think that that 19th century construct needs to be put into its historical construct, just as the commodification of the global art system does too. And in writing borderless histories of art with a lowercase a, it's not the fine arts that I'm talking about. It's about that very complex discourse. And I have no desire to keep using that word art myself. But if we're going to be having a discussion, we can't just eliminate, you can't just eliminate the history of the discourse. So this is a history of Eurocentrism and looking at the emancipatory potential of that historical discourse. So that in another nutshell is what this book is. And I'm not using that word art as the commodity that it is. Actually, I'm opting for a version of art that focuses on process. And so in that last chapter where I actually cite Amelia again and her work in the context of Creole and Caribbean discussions of hybridly humanness, I also take issue with using that word in a different way. So to open up the discussion to lots of other different points of view, I would, welcome getting rid of the word, but not getting rid of the history of how we got to that place, because that would be like, I remember when I was, I don't know, many years ago, there was something called the doctorate in humanities and a doctorate in science. So what is that for? There's no history to those concepts in the way of a field. So I myself believe that in order to unpack a field and to think critically and to rethink it and to get rid of those narrow fields, we cannot get rid of the history of the scholarship and the history of the discourse. Although when we're thinking about contemporary practice, that's certainly quite possible to do. And I think many people's work, including Amelia's specialization in performance studies, does do that. And there's no real reason to keep thinking about art per se, because it's something much broader. Well, visual studies was something that was supposed to do that, and it does broaden it. I have a critical discussion of visual studies too, because it's still dependent, that visual studies is still dependent on that Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian theory of cognition, that things are made for the object of the perception of the sense of sight. So you still haven't gotten rid of it. That didn't work either. As for artifacts, I mean, artifactual, that's that every work of art is also an artifact. So those categories that we put on those works, that needs to be unpacked. And then you can do with them what you want. Right now, there's about to open a wonderful show at the Getty on the Guerrilla Girls. I mean, there's a wonderful example of pushing back over time and what kind of effects that can do by calling out the Eurocentric, or in this case, hyper masculine, hyper patriarchal art system that we live in. But they haven't gotten rid of the art, they are critiquing it. And I have quite a bit in both of those books about indigenous art practices by, in fact, the cover of this book, which is in a slide, but we don't need it. This is an aerial view of an artwork by Megan Cope, who is an Indigenous Australian artist, and she builds oyster beds, and you're looking at it from the top down when the tide is low, and when the tide comes in, it becomes surrounded by water. And so that's a great example of indigenous artwork that is directly associated with ecological and environmental sustainability. And then she photographs these works beautifully and shows them in the gallery. So if that's an example of how to move out of some restrictive idea of art and think about it more broadly without getting rid of art. It just, generically, before the 19th century got hold of it, it meant just anything that is made by human art. That's the techne. In Aristotle, when we have the 16th century understanding of art, it refers to everything: religion, government, buildings, practices, everything is techne. It's how people were judged on the basis of their techne. So if they didn't have techne in the European sense, then maybe they weren't fully human. And that's exactly how the degrees of humanness discourse developed, and became racial theory over a period of some years. I'm not talking about a unilateral or linear progress theory. I'm talking about the persistence of certain epistemological understandings and thought structures that are maybe not being looked at, that which escapes scrutiny. I don't know, did I wander way off base, Zrinka? Did I address your question?
No, I wasn't trying to suggest that you would want to just do away with the history of with art discourse. That's not what I was trying to say. I prefer to try to modify, right, what art means
Yeah.
than just ban the word art. That's not what I was trying to suggest. But I do think um, it is kind of a thankless effort because art is so strongly marked by its more recent national colonial history, right? From the 19th, as you just explained again, from the 19th century onward. This is not the case maybe in the 16th century, and certainly not the case before. But yes, it is this constant struggle of proposing to view things differently and to include techne more globally, and then to keep that in that kind of vein, and then not to be reappropriated into art historical discourses as we know them, right? So that's the struggle, I suppose. I do have one more question for you, which I hope it might be harder or easier to answer. So you may know that one of the famous articles that keeps kind of popping up as our climate crisis grows worse was actually written by the founder of the formerly known as Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, now Center for Early Global Studies, the center that is hosting this conversation today, by someone named Lynn White Jr., who wrote this very famous article about the roots of the ecological crisis. He was a medievalist, and basically the argument is Christianity is responsible for that. Because Christianity, and especially medieval Christianity, that builds up in a sense, the posits the exploitation of the resource of the resource of the earth, right, as given to the human, as given to the original human creatures that got put there, right? And so this is a medieval story, though, that kind of tries to draw another version, right? Not a Renaissance version. And so I wanted to ask you, what is the role of the Middle Ages in your very long history?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad to know about Lynn White's essay, because I don't know it. But there might be Geraldine Heng is someone who has written more recently about the Christianity and race theory and race practices in the Middle Ages. That is really a very useful book. But as far as my work goes, I was looking at Christianity as being the drivers of this discourse in the 16th century, whereas Enlightenment philosophers are usually blamed for this discussion of nature versus culture that we are trying to unpack that. And so when you push it back by 2 centuries or 3 centuries to the early to mid 16th century, it's really interesting how concretely you can tie the universal Christian church to the exploitation of the Americas, but also, and here's where the revisionist work is going on now, is to look at the entanglement between the missionaries who were in many cases very proud of the artisanship and the craftsmanship of their converted subjects. In other cases, they were very mean and terrible. But we're looking at those colonial documents and untangling the different agencies that are involved in making those documents. So I have in my book some text boxes that talk about specific projects like that against the main narrative of just how the universal Christian church. So I'm not talking about Aristotle's politics because it's Aristotle. I'm talking about Aristotle's politics because that's what the Christian church used in the 16th century to justify the settlement and colonization of the Americas. So Francisco de Vitoria specifically was a really important thinker in this, because he said that because of hospitality and cosmopolitanism, the Spanish should be allowed to take goods from the Americas that they lack. And that, along with his idea that the Amerindians were fully rational, but they were like children that needed maybe hundreds of years to become fully civilized, were really important points, thoughts that traveled through a lot of other places. So yes, medieval Christianity is part of that too. And I'm sure that my understanding would be greatly enriched by reading Lynn White, but he's talking about the same thing, I think, in many respects that I am too. I just focused on this moment of the climate crisis as it evolved from this time on, in an entangled discourse in which humanness and art making were supporting each other, complicated and simple at the same time. So looking at constellations of ideas, that's been my approach to this. Yeah, I'm quite critical of the modern global, The Art Is Not What You Think It Is a book that I published with my husband, Donald Preziosi, in 2012. That's all about that commodity discourse. And yeah, the same, what Amelia was talking about. In fact, I've contributed a chapter to Amelia's amazing, really fantastic book. So the structure of knowledge remains European. That's what you were talking about in your introduction that I thought was so important, that I cited it in my own book too. So the structure of knowledge remains European. It doesn't need to, but it is in this dominant discourse.
Yeah, and I wonder if we can write a book in English published by Routledge that's not, like we're all still in these Eurocentric universities speaking English.
That's one of the things we took up in this book too, which is also in English and also by Routledge, is that this problem of monolingualism
but not just that, it's the whole way we're articulating our arguments is still particular to this internalized training that we have. And I don't have an answer, but in between subjects, I did a lot of research into the Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, and there's a really rich body of theory that's about kind of reversing the Eurocentrism by looking at not just how indigenous people talked about Europeans, which is great, but actually Lee Wallace wrote a book called Sexual Encounters, where she theorizes that the entire Western concept of sexuality, as it starts to get parsed out around 1800, which Foucault writes about in the History of Sexuality, that entire concept, she argues, comes from the fact that Europeans were having encounters with indigenous Pacifica peoples who had unexpected forms of sexual embodiment that the British naval officers didn't know what to do with.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, so their accounts, it's still their accounts, but she's able to argue that this whole thing we think of as European concepts of sexuality actually wouldn't exist outside of these encounters. So it was really a great kind of bumped me out of this problem of we just keep reinforcing the Eurocentrism even as we're critiquing it, that problem.
Right. What she, I don't know her book either, but what she's talking about, that happened in the Southwest too. So ideas of sexuality were quite different. Unfortunately, there's a very Eurocentric account of some of that. The very word burdash, of a man-woman that takes on the role of women, but is sexually is male. Burdash, that's a terrible word borrowed from French, meaning something like prostitute. So that's not a good word either. But when I was working on that project of the intersection or the contact zone of the American Southwest many years ago, looking at the contributions of Native American culture to a tradition, an entangled tradition of saints, of picturing saints. That came up quite a bit. So it'd be very rich to be rethinking gender and sexuality through all these other lenses as well. One reason that I quote Indigenous scholars is that I'm not speaking for them, but I quote them directly, both in this book and in the anthology, and so do some of my contributors, so that we don't have to, dialogues are great, like the dialogue we're having now. We don't have to come to one definition. This book is not about how to think about art. It's how to strategize. It's how to unpack, to give some tools and also some incentive of how to unpack this history, how to come up with lots of other different ways. My unpacking is from my strength of the intellectual history of the Western idea of art. But there are many other stories to tell.
Yeah. Are there any other comments or engagement in this debate? Any suggestions, proposals?
Yeah, I have one. This is Maya with the J.
Yeah.
Hi. When I was listening, I remember when I was in high school studying medieval art, and we talked about, the great chain of being,
Right.
and this, so that there was this hierarchy to life forms, and which is kind of, I think, what you've been discussing this whole time. So, it's really peculiar how that gets, really hammered out in the Middle Ages and sort of becomes, it seems to be the urban legends that people continue with them to this day. This sense of of hierarchies that they can't even articulate to themselves. I'm just talking about person in the street. Like when you ask them what great art is, they're going to respond based on this sort of like internal idea of hierarchies that no one's even conscious of. And to me, it seems like it does kind of point back to this and does relate to our relationship to nature right now.
Right,
Yeah.
it does. And there's a lot of concrete detail in my book about that, and including about the great chain of being, which was also an account that Darwin depended on. So I'm looking at Darwin's indebtedness to Christian great chain of being ideas at a time when he was developing a theory of the continuity of humans and evolution, but still was indebted to that. The historical reasons for that are quite complex. He was working in London trying to convince a group of Christian scientists at the Royal Academy of his theory of evolution. And so he placed savages in between civilized humans and all the other animals as a way to have his theory of evolution accepted. And it was more complicated than that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Those unconscious, unthought ideas that are still circulating, that's what education is all about, of pulling those out to the level of consciousness so that we understand where those assumptions are coming from. That is so key to any teacher's practice, I think. It certainly was on my mind when I was in the classroom.
That goes back to what you were saying about responsibility.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a beautiful place to end. It's like a closed
responsibility. Yeah. Oh, there's another question though, Caroline.
Even better.
Hi, I really am appreciating this conversation. I look forward to getting your book in 10 to 12 business days. But I can't help but to think of how much of what you're talking about has a lot to do with the things that is also being talked about with engaged Buddhism in the world right now. And I started to, I kept thinking, oh, I bet she's, so it's very much like Joanna Macy's work that reconnect, David Loy, and the ideas are so similar, but then it does seem to bring us to a place of being able to be present, showing up for others in the crisis, that we may not be able to change the whole crisis, but just to have an embodied involvement with it that can take it from this incredible new way of looking at things, or many new ways of looking at things. And there's so much work with Indigenous people, and in addition to the climate crisis, social justice, racial justice. It's so overlapping. So I'm curious if you had some background in that, or just rubbing elbows with that as well. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
I
Yeah, go ahead.
practice engaged Buddhism, and I actually brought that into our conversation the other day, Claire.
Yeah, and I became aware of Joanne Macy's work after I finished this book project, but it's definitely, yeah, in tune with what I'm interested in learning more about. So, yeah, it's got to be a collaborative practice. In fact, if we have time, Amelia, could you show the penultimate? There's a slide of the gate that was used for the flyer of the gate in Ouida, Benin, of the couple coming back from the gate that memorializes slavery.
Sorry, you mean this one?
No, that's Darwin.
No, this one.
That one. So there's quite a lot about enslavement and the discourse on slavery in my book, and historically as well. And I'm indebted to the work of many scholars. Oh, okay, just keep it there.
Yeah, sorry, that was.
That's okay. And so my book ends with this, because these people are coming back from the gate of no return. And could you show the next screen? And then this is the last sentence of the whole book that goes back to the musical metaphor. In bringing this thought experiment full circle, I emphasize that all producers of knowledge share the ethical responsibility to understand how this knowledge shapes society. By necessity, this must be a collective endeavor. When, if not now, should we make promises together and act in concert? It cannot be an individual project. It cannot be done with one set of ideas. One set of worlds, multiple worlds, pluriversal. And I use the word planetary, not world or global in this book as well, and post-human. And we didn't talk about that so much today, but it's implicit in what I was saying.
Well, it's a wonderful place to end. I agree. Perfect moment to wrap. I mean, the perfect kind of way to reflect the responsibility to wrap things up, but really to open things up, I would say, right? By giving us this call to collective endeavor of responsibility. So I'm very grateful that you had agreed for us to record this event, because it has been a really stimulating discussion and a stimulating presentation. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, so it can continue to generate
Fantastic.
the debate, but also continue to generate, hopefully, the call to responsibility for those who couldn't actually join us in person today. So thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for this book. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, great. Thank you for the great opportunity and the discussion. It's been very rich. Do we have a second that you could show? There is a discount flyer that I put in at the end.
I think that was in the chat.
It's in the chat.
Yeah,
oh, it's in the chat.
They already got that info.
Okay, even better. Well, thank you so much, Zrinka. Thank you for enabling this discussion. It
was a pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Bye-bye, everyone.